This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Hello, everybody. One of the things that people may wonder when they go to a zoo or a museum is there are millions of species of animals, and yet the morphology changes tremendously within the same group. And today we have someone who is an expert about this kind of morphological diversity that we find. His name is Dr. Zachary Calamari. He was born in Mount Kisco, New York. It's a small town, not far from Manhattan. And he grew up in northern Michigan. He received his bachelor's in science from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and his doctorate in biology from Richmond Gilder Graduate School at the American Museum of Natural History of New York. And today he's an assistant professor in the Department of Natural Sciences at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, Baruch College, City University of New York. Welcome to College Talk, Dr. Calamari.
Hi, thank you for having me.
The first question I like to ask my guests here is why they chose the career they're in. Why do you choose biology?
Yeah, I was a dinosaur kid growing up. I was always interested in, different dinosaurs. I had an entire book of like all the dinosaurs, and I'm sure I knew it by heart. And as I just grew up, that was always like kind of an underlying theme of my life. You know, understanding history. Human history for a while I was interested in, but eventually I came back to life history and evolution. I like learning about things that happened, millions of years ago. So
you became interested in that before or after the Jurassic Park series?
I think it was before. I'm pretty sure it was before. Yeah,
because that actually created a lot of interest.
It did. Yeah.
Now, within biology, you chose the specific area of morphology.
Mm-hmm.
Why was that?
So I'm interested in basically biological shape and how your body makes things that are different shapes. Specifically, I'm interested in this morphology of horns and antlers and things like that, and why does a deer have branching antlers and a cow has curved horns? Like, what makes that different? So I think it's just a question where there's a lot of interesting processes happening that no one's really explored as in depth as they could with modern technologies.
One of the type of things you have been looking at in your career are teeth, because we know humans have different type of teeth, but also the number, size, and the shape of teeth vary from species to species. What can we learn by studying the teeth in different species?
Yeah, you actually can learn so much information from teeth. And in fact, paleontology itself is largely reliant on fossilized teeth to understand fossil animals and the diversity of things that have been alive on this planet for millions of years. Within the research that I've done on teeth, I did a lot of work in undergrad on using mammoth and mastodon tusks to understand basically ancient climates. So a mammoth tooth grows like a series of cones. Like if you stack up cones and you keep putting new cones of tooth material at the base of that tooth. And what you can do is go in and use basically a dental drill, just like you'd find at a dentist's office, and drill out powdered samples of tooth material. Use that to study the different oxygen and carbon isotopes that make up that tooth. And basically, since that tooth was laid down in layers throughout that animal's life, you can correlate the changes in those isotopes to what the climate was doing. So you can see things like whether it was winter when they died or if they died in the spring. And you can learn things like human behavior. When were they hunting? If maybe you find a mammoth or mastodon that has butchering marks on it. Is this an animal that died just because it's hard to survive the winter? You can pick up a lot just from these chemicals that make up a tusk. Some of my other research has focused on using rodent teeth as a model for different aspects of human teeth. So specifically, I worked a little bit on how molars that get roots, whether they stop growing at some point. So when your tooth develops a root, that's basically the end of its growth. And teeth that keep growing continuously throughout life, I've used that as a way to understand what maintains the stem cells in your tooth as it's developing, so before the roots, take place. So there's a lot of things that, just a tooth, unassuming. Most people don't think about their teeth that much, but they've got a ton of information.
And of course, also we can learn about the way those animals ate, because
Absolutely.
the different type of teeth have different functions depending on the kind of food you're using.
Yeah, so like mammal teeth obviously have different shapes based on where they are in the mouth and what their function is, right? So definitely.
Okay. Another aspect of morphology you have studied are horns, which we see a great diversity of horns among mammals when we go to the museum. What is the significance of horns? Because we have seen some movies in which you see animals fighting and, heading into each other. But are there other functions for horns?
That's one of those things where there's one function that we know, that we see animals using their horns for, or it's like two functions, right? It's either for fighting or defending themselves. There are some people who think that animals use their horns and antlers and other cranial structures as a way to focus their mate choice. So when you're mating, you don't want to waste effort mating with something that's outside of your species that you're not really going to be able to successfully pass on your genetic material with. And this idea is that some of these structures are helping these animals basically pick out what they can and can't mate with.
Will the size of a horn also indicate the female that animal is healthier, so the chances for passing on the genes more successfully is an indication based on the size of the horns?
It can. It depends on the type of cranial appendage often. So something like a horn that an animal grows throughout life and is maintained throughout life, obviously it takes a lot of energy and health to grow a really large horn and carry it around. And it's harder to cheat at having that, but a lot of those horns are used in basically reproductive competition with other males. So that's more of like you gain access to males by fighting off your challengers. And antlers are used that way as well, but one of the ideas about something like an antler is that it's a foolproof signal of your quality. You can't grow a really large antler if you're having a bad year, basically. It takes a lot of energy. You have to be able to basically sacrifice that energy to this large structure, and you have to grow it in an entire season, right? So an antler falls off and is regrown once a year in most cases. And if you're, a weak male, or if you're old and infirm, you're not going to be able to grow this large antler. And so what this idea is that signals to females and even other males that you're some strong, tough specimen who's able to pass on strong, healthy genes.
Another structure you have studied are tusks. And of course, when you mention tusks, the first image that comes to your mind are elephants. What have you learned by studying tusks among different species?
So most of the work that I did was actually on fossil tusks, things from mastodons, which were sort of stout, hairy elephants, not quite as closely related to modern elephants as other things, but they were interesting. They lived around the Great Lakes region, and the really important stuff that we understand from them is as I said earlier, paleoclimate, so basically what the temperature was, but we can also figure out things like what human activity was like right around the end of the time when these animals were going extinct. And there are some people who think that they were basically over-hunted to extinction. We see things like, if you look closely at those patterns of tusk growth and the isotopes that show up in tusks, some people think that you can see the signal from when a mother mastodon was weaning her calves. And based on that, you can find these recurring patterns where it looks like a mother starts to wean her calf, and then in a time frame that isn't what you would expect, say based on modern elephant biology and when they wean calves and give birth to new calves, she suddenly is weaning another calf. And what they think that might represent is that these Paleo Indians were hunting mammoth calves, and that added pressure along with a warming climate coming out of the Ice Age, or the glacier period of that Ice Age, contributed to this species, especially in the Great Lakes region, going extinct.
And I think that's an important point, because they're having a lot of debate about why actually a wide range of large mammals disappear about the same time that humans were conquering the Americans coming from Asia. And the question was always, well, was it just because they were over-hunted because they were large and they were easy to eat, to kill, or is because there was a changes in climate that could accommodate for that? Even some people think it's a combination of both.
Absolutely.
What's your opinion on that?
I would say, a combination of things is almost certainly, what you would expect. And a lot of times when there's some contentious debate and people are arguing about, it's definitely this way, it's definitely this way, we do find things where it's a combination, So I wouldn't be surprised if that question shakes out to have a much more complex answer than, it was definitely overhunting, it was definitely, a warming climate. These are all things that basically stress out biology, and especially if you're some large animal where your reproduction is slow and you might only have one offspring per mating season, and then you take a few years before you have your next offspring, any sort of extra pressure on that cycle can really throw things out of balance.
Another structure that you have studied are hoofs. What people know about hoofs, but what is the evolutionary history of hoof? Why hoof came about in a particular set of mammals?
That's an interesting question. Hooves are basically, they're made out of the same material as your fingernail, and I'm not actually sure what their reason for coming about is. They're a good covering. They offer a strong protection for these animals that are what we call digitigrade. They run and walk on the tips of their toes. So if you look at a horse, it's, the hoof of a horse is basically on what is a single toe bone, which puts a lot of pressure on that bone. So if you have a hard tissue covering there, it's basically good protection for, running around on just your toes.
So will you say it will be fair to describe hoofs as a overdeveloped toe in order to deal with the fact of running and the terrain?
Basically.
Okay, good. By the way, this reminds me of an old anecdote. You probably have heard about this, of the famous French naturalist Georges Cuvier in 19th century, who he said that I know so much about the animals that you give me one bone and I can't reconstruct the whole animal. And the story, as it goes, is that he was so into his work that he actually had a room in the Museum of Natural History in Paris. And one night, some of his colleagues wanted to play some practical joke with him and came into his room wearing some of the hives of the animals in the museum with horns and hoofs. And they got into his room and they said, "Cuvier, Cuvier, we are going to eat you." And then Cuvier responded, you have hoofs and horns. all animals with hoofs and horns and herbivores, you cannot eat me. And he went back to sleep. I don't know if you have heard of that story.
I have not heard that, but that's a good story. Yeah.
And it's true. You have hoofs and horns. You
generally don't. A lot of hoofed mammals are actually, though, people don't really know this, they're opportunistic carnivores.
Yeah.
So things like reindeer, living out on the tundra, it's a tough environment to live in. The plants aren't particularly nutritious. And sometimes they will eat small mammals because you get a boost of, materials that you need that you're not necessarily getting from these, tundra plants.
Yeah.
And, whether they're doing it intentionally or if they're just accidentally eating a vole burrow that's made out of like a pile of grass. Maybe a little debatable, but we definitely find lots of hoofed mammals who do some interesting things that aren't necessarily associated with herbivory.
Yes.
There's an island of I think it's off of Scotland where there are red deer that eat the bones of other animals. They'll go and chew on the bones because they need the calcium. They're not getting it from the plants that they eat.
Yes.
So opportunistic carnivory is a really interesting thing that...
and I think that's the underlying story behind evolution, that evolution is opportunistic.
Absolutely.
And that's why we have such a diversity of animals and plants, and how, despite all the things that have happened to our planet, like mass extinctions and all that kind of things, still we have a healthy diversity out there.
Exploit some niche.
Yeah, exactly. You also have used fossils in order to better understand the evolutionary history of a particular group. Will you say that you are fortunate that you chose structures that are usually well preserved because of their size and the hardness in terms of the own chemistry? Is that something that you feel that this it makes your life easier?
A little bit. So the fossil record is interesting for horns and antlers and other cranial appendages, and it actually differs based on which cranial appendage you're looking at. Some things are attached to the skull in a way that preserves them a little more easily. Antlers, which are shed every year, we find pieces of antlers loose, obviously, because they fall off and they get buried, but finding them actually attached to a skull isn't as common. Since a horn grows directly out of the skull, finding animals with horns where they still have that horn core, the inner permanent bone core of the horn, attached to their skull, a little more common. So it really depends on what you're interested in, which family of hoofed mammal you're studying. But yeah, the fossil record, because I'm looking at a hard tissue structure, is a little bit easier than someone trying to maybe study musculature or hearts. They'd have to do a little more inference about what they're seeing in their fossils.
I remember once teaching a biology class, a student very naively, but I think very sincerely, asked me, "How about unicorns?" And we know there's no such a thing as unicorns. However, there is a marine mammal, the narwhal, who looks like having a unicorn, but it's actually a tooth, coming out, and it's very prominently, very long, and it's particularly among males that you find it, and there actually are videos of males using these teeth like swords in fights, which is similar to what we see in with horns in many other mammals. So there are many ways to produce these kind of structures that have all these type of different functions, and who would think that a tooth can become so long, and so useful for those things. Now you have been using X-rays to study some of these structures, but also there's new technology, tomography, and all that sort of things. To what extent do you think that new technologies can help you to better understand the origin and evolution of these kind of structures?
So absolutely. It's one of our most actually important things, because I do a lot of 3D surface scanning with like handheld 3D scanners, and those allow us to make like a really high quality digital representation of these fossils relatively easily without damaging the fossil in any way. You don't have to cut it, you don't have to do anything. You can get this like nice surface scanner. Another thing that people are using a lot is CT, so tomography, to make really high-resolution scans of the inner parts of, like a fossil skull. And that's really allowed people to do things like look at the shape of the inner ear and the bony labyrinth that basically encases the inner ear to understand how things like hearing has evolved, balance, since all of these structures are encased in bone and leave some sort of remnant in your cranium when you die. You can actually look at that and both use it as a character to reconstruct relationships between fossil animals, but also understand things like, how did this animal orient itself in its environment? What was it maybe good at? There's a particularly interesting fossil cheetah study where they looked at the inner ear and they used it to make inferences about how the fossil cheetah might have been adapted differently for running compared to modern large cats, based on this structure and how we know that it affects, how they stabilize their head as they run in modern animals. So it's an absolutely, being able to see inside the skull without breaking it open is absolutely an amazing thing.
And I think that has also been used to understand animals who use quite different frequencies that we use in hearing, like, for example, bats for echolocation or dolphins for the same thing, how they have changed the shapes and the structure of those inner ear bones to adapt to those things. So you can learn a lot by using that kind of things. Okay. Now you have also used molecular approaches to your study, which is basically looking at the DNA of these different structures. How much can we learn about the evolution of these structures by looking to the DNA, especially when you have to look at, unlike the actual morphological fossil, it's not always that easy to find the ancient DNA of other animals.
Right. So I'm interested in how gene expression and expressing different levels of genes at different times during development can generate these different shapes that we see in fossil animals. So obviously we can't see how a fossil is expressing certain genes. Unfortunately, RNA, the type of DNA that gets expressed, doesn't preserve well in the fossil record. So what we do is I look at modern animals and how their RNA expression changes during development as a way to see what patterns we can find, and then eventually apply that to the shapes that we see in the fossil record.
I think that when we mentioned this movie before, Jurassic Park, there was all this hype about bringing back extinct animals, and one of the candidates actually were the mammoth. They say, well, let's take the DNA of an elephant that is more or less related, and then make the modification.
Yeah.
But it's not that easy, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. It's a real sort of future tech idea, either making an elephant look and act more like a fossil mammoth or mastodon, or certainly I'd say we're pretty far away still from pulling DNA out of like a frozen mammoth and using that to clone a mammoth or mastodon. So it's.
Okay. So one thing is Hollywood, another thing is reality.
Yeah. And it's certainly basically the shelf life of DNA is much shorter than when the non-avian dinosaurs, the dinosaurs that aren't modern birds, the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct long before anything that we've ever pulled ancient DNA out of existed. So
65 million years ago. Or even
versus
longer.
like maybe 40,000 years.
Exactly.
So it's probably not going to happen.
Now, when you talk about these topics with your students, how do you see the reaction or the interest about starting to ask questions like the ones I just asked you about the origin and evolution of this structure? How interested they become in these kind of topics?
I think anytime you can link it to some interesting mystery, which is a lot of what we find in the fossil record. We see these interesting shapes, these interesting animals that don't seem to have modern equivalent. It's a great way to say, like, here's something that you don't see anymore. Like, let's figure out how that happened. And I think it's a really engaging way to basically boost their interest in maybe just learning about how a lung works. Anything really. But it's got a built-in excitement factor to look at the fossil record. And
What's your next big project?
I'm really interested in using, again, still this gene expression to expand beyond the farm animals that are easier to get. Like, so I've done a lot of sampling of basically livestock because they're around, they're abundant. I'd really like to get some samples from more exotic animals like water buffalo or giraffes especially would be amazing to get some tissue samples there. So really expanding this into things that aren't as common and have different cranial appendage types to understand what's going on in their tissues as well as they grow their horns and antlers and other bony appendages.
Well, once you have a discovery in that area, I'll invite you again to the show.
Of course.
So we can talk about it. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Calamari about this very interesting conversation on horns, hoofs, and a bunch of many other things. And next week, we're going to have Dr. Joshi Cohen-Charash, of the Department of Psychology at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, who will be talking about envy at the workplace. So it should be very interesting.
Interesting.
So stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences. All rights reserved, 2018.